back. Okay. All right, folks, we're just going to wait here a second or two while folks, wherever you are in the world, will pop up. If you are on the west coast of the United States, you are just waking up, having your breakfast, and thank you so much for joining us. Hello, everyone. This is George Thomas with CBN News, the Christian Broadcasting Network, senior international correspondent. I'm normally traveling the length and the breadth of this world, but I find myself these last few days in our nation's capital here in Washington, D.C., gathered for the second day of the International Religious Freedom Summit, a very, very important summit. This is the fourth year that they have held this. They have brought together a wide spectrum of unusual characters across the political spectrum, as well as more importantly, the faith spectrum. You have Buddhists, you have Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Falun Gong, atheists even, who are part of the second day of the summit, all focused on the issue of human rights and religious freedom. There are just a plethora of speakers, plenary speakers, folks who are on the front lines of championing the cause of human rights and religious freedom around the world, folks who have come from very, very sensitive places like Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, Pakistan, all sensitive countries, all of them on the front lines trying to bring a focus to the issue of human rights and religious freedom. So my next guest has a bit of a different twist. She is an artist and a human rights advocate, but she uses her talent and skill of painting to highlight the voices of those who have suffered immensely. My next guest is Hannah Rose Thomas, no relation to this George Thomas, but great to have you on the broadcast. Your new book is called Tears of Gold, Portraits of Yazidi, Rohingya, and the Nigerian women. Incredible testimony of these three particular groups that have suffered immensely over the many, many years. And she's used her passion for drawing and a way to use the pictures of these three groups of people to highlight the kinds of challenges that they have experienced. Right before we get into the show, listen, I know you guys are just waiting with bated breath to have questions and your questions read out and comments and questions for Ms. Thomas. Please go ahead and do that. And while you're there, hit that notification button, because you know what? You want to see me again. I know you do, right? So when the next notification comes up, we'll be doing interviews all throughout the day, and not just for myself, but our other colleagues who are spread around the world covering various issues. You do not want to miss them. I just want to say this one other thing. We are in a press room, and so it's not of disrespect that you hear other people talking. It's just that other folks are also doing their interviews. So do bear with us in terms of the noise. Okay, so the book is called Tears of Gold, and you highlight the plight of Yazidi women, the Rohingya, I'm assuming the Rohingya Muslims of Myanmar, and obviously the Nigerian women who have suffered under the tutelage of the horrific group known as Boko Haram.
Yeah.
Why use pictures to tell the story?
Well, I think art can really give you insight into individual stories behind these crises. So all too often we are bombarded by news in the media about the crises around the world, and it's very hard to really we become numb to these stories, I think. So when you hear an individual story, when you hear on the front cover there's a young woman called Sampina who had to flee Myanmar, a young Muslim woman, and she has endured unimaginable losses and is now in a refugee camp in Bangladesh. But when you encounter an individual, it enables you to connect with their stories and can inspire empathy and understanding and remind us also of our shared humanity as well.
Sure, and you can speak up as well, okay?
Yes.
So in that's okay. So this is like the one place where you can scream, okay? And it's not a problem, and our viewers will totally understand. So we all remember the plight of the Yazidi people group in Iraq that suffered under ISIS several years ago when the United States launched its war on terror. The Yazidis, how are they doing today? We don't hear too much about them.
Well, you see, it's the 10-year anniversary this year for the crisis in Sinjar. So I remember vividly when seeing on the news of ISIS taking control of Sinjar, and you hear all the stories about these women being taken captive. So I had the privilege of traveling to Iraqi Kurdistan for the 3rd anniversary of that crisis. So that was some 7 years ago now. And I taught the women how to paint their portraits as a way to share their stories with the rest of the world. And then they asked whether I would also paint their portraits. So in my exhibitions in the House of Parliament and other places, I've shown their paintings alongside my paintings, and they're displayed like this in the book as well. So it's a way to give them voice. They've given back their voices and make sure that their stories are remembered and heard, and a testament to them and their dignity.
When you meet these women, what's the one thing or two things that you take away from their spirit?
I have never ceased to be amazed by the extraordinary resilience and the dignity of these women who have suffered unimaginable horrors. I mean, I can't begin to imagine how I would respond if I was in their place. If my children were still in the hands of ISIS, or if I had endured living in Boko Haram captivity for 4 years and being forced to be forcibly married to Boko Haram soldiers. So these stories are just beyond what we can comprehend, but their dignity and also their faith as well, and their kindness is it's just a miracle, nothing short of a miracle.
Today, the statistics say close to about 365 million Christians are suffering around the world, according to the folks from IRM. Close to about 80% of the of the population of the globe experience some form of oppression. The reality is that you have countless Muslims, for example, in India, who are dealing with a very nationalistic Hindutva, run by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. You have the situation in Thailand. You have the situation in Myanmar. Let's focus among the Xinjiang, among the Uyghur people of China. Let's focus a little bit about in Myanmar. How would you, for our viewers to understand the conflict that the Muslims in Myanmar are experiencing today, how would you explain that to our viewers? Like, what are they facing, and why is the government targeting them specifically?
I'm not an expert in the Rohingya or all these stories, but I just know the women that I've met personally. So I had the privilege traveling out to Bangladesh just 6 months after the genocide or the mass exodus in 2017, and the stories of the women were just horrendous.
Is there a particular story that stood out, or perhaps the person that you profiled?
There's Samkina who witnessed her father being killed, and the women, they all experienced their villages being burned, and they were forced to flee, and spent I think Samkina said she spent 14 days in the jungle walking to get to the border to cross over into Bangladesh, and many of them were even attacked on that border as well as they were crossing into Bangladesh, and they lost their loved ones just on the border as they were about to reach safety. So they're just absolutely heartrending, and also and the conditions that they're living in the camps. It was enormous camp. There's a massive problem with human trafficking, drug trafficking, and forced labor as well. So, and they're on the most climate vulnerable kind of coastlines in the world. So they are at risk of being doubly displaced with the climate crisis as it is. So the situation is dire, and we don't hear enough about it because there's so much going on in the world. It's so easy to look for our empathy, for our compassion to move on to the next crises. But the reality is these women are still in the camps, and they're still in this situation. So same with the Yazidi women, the Nigerian women as well that I met. Many of them are still in IDP camps in northern Nigeria. So it feels this work is just a drop in the ocean. You just wish you could do so much more to amplify their voices, to make a difference, to help these women in these situations.
As Hannah mentioned, it does feel sometimes overwhelming when you're jumping from one fire to another fire, and it just seems like whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Gaza, and now potential in Iraq and Syria, or with Iran, it's just like it's accentuating. If you have not if you're not familiar with the Rohingya people, I just suggest you do a Google search. They are in a part of Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, and they have really suffered just unimaginable atrocities. I have a colleague, a good friend of mine, a colleague, Chuck Holton, who is, and you see his YouTube live links on our channel. He's right now in Texas. He's a globetrotter around the world. He's right now trying to get into Myanmar. It's not easy to go and focus on not just the Christians who in the south, but also on the Muslims, the Rohingya Muslims. I highly recommend, highly suggest that if you're not familiar with them, at least as a point of reference, just Google them and you will see they in many ways are in the dark corners of the world where there's not a lot of press, there's not a lot of attention on them. One group of people that have equally suffered, not to compare and contrast, but one group of people that have truly suffered tremendously over the last 10 years have been the Christians of Nigeria, specifically northern Nigeria. If you are a viewer of CBN News, you know that I've traveled to northern Nigeria many a times. We've done so many stories on the plight of victims of Boko Haram. Talk about the lady that you profiled in your book, who endured the atrocities of Boko Haram.
So I had the privilege of traveling to northern Nigeria with Open Doors.
Yeah.
And that was also to do an art workshop with the women, teaching them how to paint their stories, to share this, to paint their portraits, to share their stories with the world. And these women had never painted in their lives before, never picked up a pen, and they created these beautiful works of art. But their stories were absolutely heartrending. It was a privilege to have the chance to sit with them, to hear their stories, and then to paint their portraits. So there was one woman called Charity who'd been held in Boko Haram captivity for 3 years, I believe it was, and she was living in an IDP camp in northern Nigeria. And her husband had beat her, rejected her when she returned with a baby that was born while she was in captivity. And she said that this wasn't the stigma around sexual violence, around what these women have suffered, and the fact that they're rejected in their communities when they return home is just a pain that is unimaginable, just heartbreaking to hear.
When you think about somebody being held captive, we think of Leah Sheribu, who almost, I think it's coming up to the 10-year or 6-year anniversary. It's unbelievable that folks like this continue to be held in captivity. I'm curious, Hannah, when you give them the paintbrush, when you give them the pencil, probably they're not as good as of an artist as you are, but what does art and being able to have a pictorial depiction of themselves and to put that to paper, what does that do to them personally? And to also know that there's somebody who's using her own talent to showcase, to highlight and put a spotlight on their suffering.
I believe, I'm not an art therapist, but I do know from my own experience the therapeutic value of art and how it can express that which can't be put to words. So these experiences that the women have suffered are beyond what can be articulated in words. So I think art, in all different forms, has the power of expressing that which eludes verbal communication. So it's a way to give them a voice to something of what they've experienced. But they also knew that their self-portraits and my paintings would be going around the world and shown in places like House of Parliament and Buckingham Palace and other places like the UN. There's also a sense that they've been remembered, that they weren't forgotten, that they were being a voice for other women in their community, and they were being a voice to raise awareness about the situation in Nigeria, and to know that, because I use icon painting methods, and Open Doors displayed this exhibition in churches around the UK, and as a point of prayer, to know that they were being prayed for, they were being remembered, they weren't forgotten. Because all too often these stories go unseen and unheard.
Absolutely, and especially when it just accentuates and the victims, whether you talk about what's happening today in Gaza or in Israel and in neighboring countries. I'm curious, is there as you travel and you showcase the works of art here, is there a thread that you have seen or a theme that you've seen in the amongst the victims of persecution that you find in commonality to them?
I guess the painting style that I use is kind of, it draws on this, because it's this common human experience of loss.
Of
It's
loss.
universal in grief.
Yeah.
Women who've lost loved ones, women whose dignity has been taken from them. But there's a common so the way I use these icon painting methods that are reminiscent of icons of the Virgin Mary is to draw that symbolism of the Mater Dolorosa, the Mother of Sorrows. These paintings in the Northern Renaissance that show the grief of the Virgin Mary, because she too knew what it was to be displaced and for her heart to be pierced with grief, the loss of her son. So it's drawing that thread, but from the Virgin Mary to the common day, to the present day, of these portraits of the women, and through that thread of grief. And it is a shared universal experience. And I think all too often it's very easy for the superficial differences between us to cause division. But there's so much that we have in common, so much. Like, there was moments of laughter when we were doing the workshops together, but also moments of tears when they were sharing their stories. So all this experience was shared. Like Desmond Tutu says, we are harmed together, but we heal together. And sharing stories and that finding that common ground is what's needed now more than ever, at a time of such polarization.
And in that midst of healing that they find, isn't it remarkable the hope that they have?
Yeah.
Despite
Absolutely
the tragedy of what they have experienced.
Absolutely remarkable. It's nothing short of a miracle.
Yeah.
I've been incredibly humbled just hearing their stories and their faith as well. The Nigerian women were like praying for me.
Yeah,
like they were
that's insane, right?
It's incredible.
Yeah. It's like, oh, no, don't pray for me. No, seriously,
No.
really, right? Exactly.
Absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah.
Truly, like the most. I've always felt that these women, they're what Jesus says: the last will be first, the first will be last. They are forgotten. They're like many of the forgotten corners of the world today, but in heaven they will be remembered and celebrated.
Amen. And I think of, for example, what's happening to the women in Afghanistan, right? Since the Taliban took over. I mean, just imagine you don't give access to women, more than half the population, and not having a chance to have a future just because of some warped, interpretation of their religion. Sadly, and I'm sure you've seen this, and I've seen this, that women in many cases in these situations, whether dealing with sex trafficking, human rights, religious freedom, they seem to really bear the brunt of the suffering, don't they?
Yeah, very much so. They're often, particularly women who are from religious minority communities, are doubly vulnerable because both of their gender but also their religion. So that's kind of, they suffer as a result of both.
The book is called Tears of Gold. When somebody purchases this, what do you hope that they walk away with?
I hope that the book just is a reminder that we're all made in the image of God and of equal value in His eyes, regardless of race or religion or gender or any of these differences between us, and that we can, in our day-to-day interactions and all that we meet, we're reminded to look for that image of God in all that we meet, and you never know what stories people are carrying.
Yeah, appreciate it. Fantastic. Folks, the book is called Tears of Gold, Portraits of Yazidi, Rohingya, and Nigerian Women. It has been forwarded by His Royal Highness, the Prince of Charles, the Prince of Wales. Really fantastic. Listen, folks, we are here at the International Religious Freedom Forum, highlighting again the great work that people all around the world do on behalf of those who are persecuted for their faith. Miss Hannah Rose Thomas doing her part, using pictures, using paintings as a way to highlight in her own way, using her talents and her passion to do that. If you would like to purchase this book, I'm sure you can go to wherever books are sold in the world. I would say Amazon, I guess, and other places. Thank you so much for coming on the broadcast. Really, really appreciate it. And congratulations on the book. And continue to share and put a spotlight on those who suffer for their faith. Really appreciate it. Okay, folks, so we will have a lot more interviews later on. Remember, if we haven't had a chance to get to your comments, get to your questions, I know somebody was talking about, we continue to pray for the women around the world who suffer for their faith. Thank you for that comment. Thank you for your prayers. And if you've got questions for any of our previous guests, roll them in. I'll try to answer them throughout the day. And also that notification, I got to keep saying this, that notification. You want to see more of me? Hit that notification. Anyway, this is George Thomas for CBN News. I hope to join you again soon, very soon. Goodbye. All right, we got it.